October 25th, 1944. Dawn over the Philippine Sea. A thin curtain of mist rises from the waves, and through it appears something impossible. A lone American destroyer, USS Johnston, racing at full speed directly toward the most powerful battleship fleet Japan ever assembled. Shell splashes the size of houses erupt around her. The water boils with metal. And yet, she keeps charging. This was not a mistake, not confusion, not miscommunication. This was a deliberate attack order, given by a man who knew it would kill him. Commander Ernest E. Evans, a 36-year-old Cherokee, American skipper with a reputation for being fearless to a fault, had just spotted a formation of Japanese warships emerging from the morning fog. Battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. Among them was Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, a floating fortress with guns the size of train cars. Johnston was 376 feet long. Yamato was 862. Johnston's guns, 5-inch. Yamato's guns, 18.1-inch, the biggest naval guns ever fired in combat. It wasn't a fight. It was a mismatch bordering on suicide. But Evans didn't hesitate. He grabbed the intercom and delivered one of the most legendary commands in U.S. Navy history. A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. We are going in. No destroyer captain in World War II had ever done what he was about to do. Every naval manual, every tactical school, every doctrine said the same thing. Small ships do not charge big guns. They stay at range. They fire smoke. They run. Evans shredded the manual. He aimed Johnston toward the Japanese line. His plan? Close the distance so fast that the enemy's giant guns couldn't depress in time. Get inside their firing arcs. Disrupt their formation. Draw fire away from the helpless escort carriers behind him. Evans believed he was buying 20, maybe 30 minutes for the carriers to escape. Nothing more. What happened next turned those few minutes into one of the most extraordinary last stands in naval warfare. An action so shocking that Japanese officers later asked, "Who were these men?" Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you love untold, real World War II stories like this. It helps us bring forgotten heroism back into the light. USS Johnston surged ahead alone, slicing through the swells at 34 knots. Behind her, 6 small escort carriers. Slow, thin-skinned tin flat tops meant for anti-submarine patrols, scrambled to launch every plane they had. These carriers were never meant to face battleships. Their aircraft were armed with depth charges instead of bombs. Some pilots took off without ammunition at all. Evans knew, if the Japanese reached those carriers, hundreds of sailors would die, and the entire Leyte invasion could collapse. At 0645, the first Japanese salvos landed. It sounded like the sky ripping open. 4 battleships and 8 cruisers fired simultaneously. The shriek of incoming shells echoed across the sea. Water erupted hundreds of feet high around Johnston. The shockwaves slammed into the ship with blows that felt like fists made of steel and thunder. The Japanese gunners were confused. They thought they were firing on cruisers, not a destroyer. Johnston was maneuvering so violently, so aggressively, that her tiny size didn't register. Evans used every trick he knew. He zigzagged unpredictably. He laid smoke curtains so thick that Japanese spotters lost their firing solutions. He accelerated until the hull shuddered. He turned the destroyer toward the incoming salvos, reducing the target profile to the width of a knife blade. Still, a cruiser's 8-inch shell smashed into the forward superstructure, blowing apart the bridge wing. Evans was wounded by shrapnel, his clothes shredded, his face bleeding. He didn't slow down. He didn't even step away from the helm. He simply wiped the blood from his eyes and growled, "Keep firing." Now within 10,000 yards, Johnston's 5-inch guns opened up. Rapid fire, fast as the crews could load. The destroyer hammered the lead Japanese cruiser Kumano, scoring hit after hit on her bridge and bow. Kumano staggered. Then a perfect broadside landed. One of Johnston's shells punched through Kumano's forward magazines and detonated inside her bow. Steel tore apart. Flames roared out. The cruiser sheared off speed and peeled out of formation. The first Japanese ship disabled. A single American destroyer had just wounded a heavy cruiser in a straight-on charge. But the price was coming. Evans knew that once he closed the range, he would have to do something even more insane, an attack that would push Johnston past every limit of what a destroyer was built to do. At 0710 hours, the sea around USS Johnston was a cauldron of spray and fire. Shells roared overhead like freight trains. Every blast shook the decks. But Commander Ernest E. Evans wasn't finished, not even close. The destroyer had crippled a Japanese heavy cruiser with gunfire alone. Now Evans prepared to deliver the blow he knew would bring the full weight of the enemy down on him. A torpedo attack. Destroyers were designed for torpedo runs, but only against ships of their own size and only with support. No doctrine on Earth suggested charging 4 battleships, including the 70,000-ton behemoth Yamato. Evans issued the order, "Stand by for torpedo attack." His men stared at him in disbelief. The Japanese formation stretched across the horizon. They were sailing at full battle speed, guns blazing. Against that wall of steel, Johnston's 10 torpedoes looked like pebbles thrown at a mountain. But Evans knew geometry. The same principle that saved pilots, submarines, and destroyers throughout the war. If he could cut hard across the enemy's line of advance, he could force the battleships to turn. Even a slight course correction could buy minutes for the escort carriers behind him. Minutes were life. He slammed the rudder over and knifed the destroyer toward the largest target. Congo-class battleships bearing down at over 26 knots. The gunners on those ships quickly realized Johnston wasn't retreating. She was closing. Fast. Their fire intensified. Salvos fell so close the impacts drenched the decks with boiling spray. Metal shrapnel clattered across the hull like hail. Evans steadied the ship. At 6,000 yards, suicidal range, he gave the command. "Fire torpedoes!" 10 fish roared from their tubes, white wakes trailing across the dark surface. Japanese lookouts spotted them too late. Battleship Congo swung hard over to avoid the spread, forcing the entire Japanese vanguard to maneuver. Their line broken, formation disrupted. Johnston had just forced multiple battleships off their attack course. But the destroyer was now broadside, fully exposed. A perfect target. An armor-piercing shell slammed into her engine room. Another hit the bow. The ship lurched as power flickered. Black smoke poured from the ruptured stacks. Still, Johnston kept fighting. Evans barked into the intercom. "We're not going down until the last shot is fired." He had bought the carriers a reprieve, but at a cost he knew was only beginning. Johnston was now bleeding steam, oil, and smoke. Her speed dropped from 34 knots to barely 17. Half her radar was gone. Communications flickered in and out. The forward guns were running low on ammunition. And yet, she turned back toward the enemy. Why? Because now other American ships were charging too, inspired by Evans's insane example. The destroyer Hull, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, and several smaller ships were rushing into the fight. Together, these tiny vessels formed what history would later call Taffy Three's Charge, the most lopsided naval engagement of World War II. But none of them were in as bad a shape as Johnston. Inside the engine room, men worked in a choking inferno to reroute power through shattered cables. Sailors passed artillery shells hand-to-hand through darkened compartments. Medics treated wounds using belts as tourniquets and bandages torn from shirts. Everywhere, the crew braced against the next blow. And it came. A burst of 14-inch and 8-inch shells tore into the ship's hull. The superstructure shuddered. Antennas sheared off. A shell ricocheted through the aft deck and exploded inside the chief engineer's compartment. Yet somehow, impossibly, the guns kept firing. At 0735, Evans spotted a Japanese heavy cruiser attempting to rejoin the line. Despite the damage, despite the odds, he aimed Johnston's remaining guns and shouted, "Target that cruiser! Fire as you bear!" The 5-inch mounts barked again, throwing out shells at their maximum rate. Johnston's strikes landed with surgical precision, smashing the cruiser's bridge, igniting fires along her decks, knocking out secondary guns. The enemy broke off her attack, veering away under a sheet of black smoke. A crippled American destroyer had just forced two heavy cruisers out of the fight. But victory had a cost. Japanese destroyers, recovering from the chaos of the torpedo attack, now closed in on Johnston's flanks. Their guns raked the deck. Machine gun bursts swept across exposed crewmen. A shell hit the port side near the waterline, flooding compartments and causing the ship to list. Evans still refused to slow down. He ordered, "More smoke. Turn toward them. Keep the guns hot." Johnston, burning and battered, pointed herself once again into the teeth of the enemy. Her crew understood now. The ship was not fighting for survival. She was fighting for time. Time for the escort carriers to escape. Time for air crews to return. Time for anyone, to live through the day. The destroyer that should have died in the opening minutes of battle kept going. And the Japanese fleet, the most powerful surface force they had left, still could not break past her. By 0800, USS Johnston was nearly unrecognizable. Fire-blackened steel, rip cables hanging like vines, streams of seawater pouring through jagged holes in her hull. Smoke so thick it turned the morning sun into a dull orange disk. Most captains would have abandoned ship, or at least withdrawn to buy time for damage control. Commander Ernest E. Evans did the opposite. He ordered the helm turned back toward the Japanese fleet again. With the engine room wrecked and steering compromised, the ship's movements were sluggish, unpredictable. Yet Evans fought her like a wounded predator refusing to yield. Crewmen on deck watched in disbelief as their destroyer wobbled around, swinging her bow toward an enemy formation she had no business challenging. The Japanese gunners couldn't believe it either. One officer later admitted they thought they were facing multiple destroyers, not one half-crippled ship. Johnston moved so erratically, firing so rapidly, that she appeared to be everywhere at once. But inside, the situation was growing desperate. The aft 5-inch gun had been smashed. The forward mounts were nearly out of shells. The automatic weapons were overheating. The crew was taking casualties at an accelerating rate. In the galley, the ship's cook, who had never trained for combat, was passing ammunition to the stern gun crew with his bare hands, ignoring burns from the hot brass. In the corridors, medics crawled through smoke-filled compartments, searching for the wounded. On the bridge, Evans stood exposed, refusing to seek cover even as splinters and shrapnel tore across the deck. Communications finally failed entirely. Johnston could neither send nor receive radio messages. Evans didn't care. He simply switched tactics. He ordered lookouts to shout target bearings down to the gunnery crews. He used a handheld megaphone to relay commands through shattered compartments. When a steering cable snapped, sailors ran below to manually operate the rudder with hand cranks. The destroyer was now being fought like a 19th century warship, by voice, by muscle, by instinct, in the middle of a 20th century naval gunfight. Then, just after 0830, a new threat emerged. A line of Japanese destroyers began massing for a torpedo attack, aiming directly at the escort carriers. If they broke through, the carriers were finished. Johnston, barely holding together, turned toward them at flank speed, or what was left of flank speed. Evans shouted over the wind, "We have to stop them. All ahead full, all we've got." It wasn't enough. The engines coughed, sputtered, then stabilized at a pitiful 15 knots. Johnston was running on sheer willpower. Still, the ship pressed on. Still, the guns fired. Still, the crew, exhausted, wounded, drenched in oil and sweat, braced themselves for another impossible fight. They knew something now that Evans had known from the beginning. There was no surviving this. There was only delaying the enemy long enough for someone else to live. At 0845, the Japanese destroyers surged forward, fast, coordinated, and deadly. Their goal was simple: launch a spread of torpedoes large enough to wipe out the American escort carriers in one stroke. The carriers, slow and exposed, had no chance of outrunning them, unless something got in the way. That something was the burning, limping USS Johnston, a ship that should not have been able to move at all. Commander Ernest Evans ordered his helmsman, "Bring us between them and the carriers." It was a death sentence. His men followed without hesitation. Johnston swung toward the oncoming destroyers, her own guns hammering at maximum rate. The Japanese opened fire with everything they had: 5-inch rounds, machine guns, fragmentation shells. Hits tore through the deck and shredded what little remained of the superstructure. Still, the destroyer cut closer. One Japanese officer later wrote that the sight was bizarre and terrifying. They had never seen a crippled ship attack at point-blank range. At 9,000 yards, Evans ordered, "Shift fire to the leader. Take out their eyes." Johnston's gunners zeroed in on the flagship destroyer Yukike's, one of Japan's deadliest and most experienced ships. A lucky 5-inch shell struck near her bridge, blasting apart rangefinders and temporarily blinding her fire control. Then Johnston opened up on the second destroyer, Hamike's, scoring multiple direct hits across her bow and midships. Smoke billowed from Hamike's as she pulled back, disrupting the torpedo attack. The Japanese formation faltered. For a moment, the entire torpedo strike collapsed into chaos. But Johnston wasn't done yet. Evans saw another opportunity, a gap forming in the attack line. If he could break through it, even briefly, he could force the Japanese to maneuver again, buying the carriers precious minutes. Through shattered wiring and jammed controls, he bellowed, "Hard over." The rudder groaned, barely responding, but Johnston turned just enough to cut across the Japanese advance. A single destroyer punching a hole through a line of 10. The Japanese Admiral Takeo Kurita was watching the battle from his flagship Yamato, the world's largest battleship, the pride of the Imperial Navy. He could not understand what he was seeing. A lone American destroyer, half-sinking, burning bow to stern, had just forced his entire destroyer screen to scatter and regroup. One of his aides wrote that Kurita stood speechless, stunned by the ferocity of the defense. Then, Johnston took another massive hit. A cruiser's 8-inch shell smashed into her starboard side, tearing open compartments and flooding the forward magazines. Steam vented in a deafening roar. The deck buckled. The bow dipped lower into the waves. Still she fought. Still she charged. Still her guns fired, even as crews loaded shells by hand through smoke-filled compartments. The Japanese destroyers regrouped and prepared another mass attack. And Johnston, unbelievably, turned yet again to meet them. By 09:15, USS Johnston was fighting on borrowed time. Water surged through her lower decks. Fires raged unchecked. Ammunition was nearly gone. Entire compartments were silent where men had once worked. The bow sat so low that waves washed across it with every roll of the ship. Yet Commander Ernest Evans still refused to break off. He had one purpose left: draw fire, all of it, away from the escort carriers. The Japanese destroyers surged again, now joined by cruisers regrouping for a final push. Shell splashes rose around Johnston like white walls. Every enemy gun that could bear turned toward the lone American ship. Evans ordered the helm to chase the new threat, but the helm didn't answer. Below deck, the last functional steering cables had finally snapped. The rudder jammed. Johnston could turn only slightly, barely enough to aim her forward guns. What had been a wounded predator was now a drifting, burning target. At 0920, a full enemy salvo found its mark. Explosions ripped across the midsection. The forward gun mount was blown apart. A geyser of smoke and steel erupted where the crew had been. Men were thrown overboard, or crushed, or simply vanished in the blast. Evans steadied himself against the ruined bridge, his uniform shredded, his face streaked with oil. He shouted down into the chaos, "Keep firing. Keep firing as long as a single gun can shoot." And they did. With the aft mounts destroyed and the forward guns crippled, only one weapon remained, a single 5-inch gun on the starboard side, barely operational, its crew working through smoke and flames. They loaded by hand, ignoring burns from overheated shells and debris raining from above. That lonely gun continued hammering the Japanese cruiser Kamano, sending out defiant bursts even as water poured into the ship's hull. Enemy gunners couldn't believe it. A ship on the verge of sinking was still shooting at them. At 0940, Evans made his final tactical decision. He ordered the crew to prepare for a potential abandoned ship, but never gave the order itself. Instead, he remained on the bridge, still exposed, still shouting bearings, still directing fire. Johnston lurched violently to port. The engines failed completely. Power died. The ship lost all forward momentum and drifted broadside to the enemy. This was the moment the Japanese realized. USS Johnston was finished. Kurita's cruisers closed in, firing at point-blank range. Shells tore through the hull like paper. Bulkheads buckled. Flames reached the mast. The sea poured in faster than pumps could hope to push it out. Still, that single 5-inch gun kept firing. The last shots of a destroyer that refused to surrender. At 0945, a direct hit struck the starboard side near the waterline. The ship shuddered from stern to bow, then slowed, then began to settle. Evans turned to his men one final time. "You did good, boys, you did good." The order to abandon ship was finally given. Sailors climbed over the rails, slipping into the cold, oil-covered sea as Johnston rolled onto her side. The stern rose once, trembling, then slid beneath the waves. The destroyer had fought her last, but the battle was not over yet. The last Japanese shell came in low and crooked, its tail sputtering in the wind. Almost as if the gun crew aboard Hamayuki knew this was their final chance. Harris watched it arc in from the starboard side, glowing orange against the haze. "Brace!" he shouted. The shell clipped the Abner Read's aft railing, ricocheted, and detonated in the water. The explosion slapped the destroyer sideways. Men were thrown to the deck. Equipment clattered. The lights flickered, but the ship stayed alive. Harris pushed himself up with a grunt, tasting copper in his mouth. Smoke rolled across the bridge like a slow tide. And then silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the thick, ringing emptiness that comes after too much noise. The Japanese guns had stopped firing. Their silhouettes faded into the mist, drifting and burning. One destroyer was listing heavily. Another was dead in the water. The radio crackled. "Enemy withdrawing. Sir, they're breaking off." A wave of relief passed across the bridge. Harris's shoulders sagged at last. He removed his helmet, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and let out a breath he'd been holding for hours. They had done it. For destroyers, outgunned, outnumbered, had smashed a Japanese raiding force at point-blank range and saved an entire convoy from destruction. But the cost. Harris looked aft. Damaged teams were still dragging hoses, stamping out fires, pulling wounded sailors from twisted metal. Dozens had died. Dozens more were fighting to stay alive. The Abner Read limped toward Manus under a gray, exhausted dawn. Burnt paint, bent steel, blood on the scuppers. And yet, she floated. As the sun rose, Harris made his final entry in the ship's log for the battle. Enemy force repelled. Convoy safe. Crew performed with courage beyond measure. He closed the logbook, rested his hands on it for a long moment, and whispered something only the dead could hear. When the destroyer finally reached port, word of the action had already spread across the Pacific. Historians would later call it the forgotten knife fight of the South Pacific, a brawl so close, so violent, so improvisational that it defied every textbook on naval warfare. But for the men who lived it, it was simply the longest night of their lives. And Commander Harris? He would never forget the last transmission he heard before the battle ended. One of his lookouts shouting into the wind. "They're turning away, sir. They're running." A rare sentence in 1944, and one bought with steel, smoke, and the stubborn refusal to die.